You spent decades imagining it. The last day, the final commute, the alarm clock you would never set again. You pictured slow mornings, long walks, books you never had time for. A life that finally belonged to you after years of handing it over to schedules, deadlines, and obligations that someone else designed. You believed, because the world told you to believe, that the moment you stopped working, something beautiful would begin. And then the moment arrived, and what you felt was not freedom. It was free fall. The first morning was quiet in a way that did not feel peaceful. It felt vacant. The second morning was the same. By the end of the first week, the silence had shifted from novelty to weight. The phone that used to ring constantly was still. The inbox that once demanded your attention sat empty. The rhythm that had organized your life for 30 or 40 years was gone, and in its place was not the spacious calm you had imagined. It was a question the working years had kept at arm's length for so long you forgot it existed. Without this, who am I? Nobody warns you about this part. The brochures show beaches. The retirement cards say congratulations. The speeches talk about well-deserved rest. But no one tells you that leaving your career can feel in the first months less like a beginning and more like a kind of death. Not physical, not dramatic, but real. The death of a structure that held you. The death of a role that named you. The death of a daily purpose that, whether you loved it or hated it, answered the question of what you were for. To understand why retirement can feel like a death, you have to understand how deeply work becomes embedded in identity over the course of a career. Because work does not just occupy time, it occupies the self. From the moment you enter the workforce, your brain begins building a relationship between what you do and who you are. This is not vanity. It is neurology. The brain is a categorization machine. It needs labels in order to organize experience, and one of the most powerful labels it builds is the one attached to your role. I am a teacher. I am an engineer. I am a manager. I am a nurse. These are not just job descriptions. They are identity anchors. They tell your nervous system where you belong, what you are responsible for, and how you fit inside the larger social structure. Over decades, this anchor deepens. Your social network organizes around it. Your daily rhythms are determined by it. Your sense of competence is measured through it. Your value, in the eyes of the world and often in your own eyes, is confirmed by it. And every year that passes adds another layer of reinforcement until the identity and the role become so intertwined that separating them feels less like a career change and more like an amputation. This is why retirement does not simply remove a schedule from your life. It removes an identity from your nervous system. And the nervous system does not process that removal as a neutral event. It processes it as loss. Deep, structural, disorienting loss. The same neural circuits that process grief after the death of a loved one are activated when a person loses a role that defined their sense of self. The brain does not distinguish between losing a person and losing a purpose. Both register as the disappearance of something the system depended on, and both produce the same response: confusion, emptiness, the frantic search for something to fill the space that used to be occupied by meaning. And the loss goes deeper than most people realize, because the identity that work provided was not just professional, it was social. It determined how people introduced you at dinner parties. It shaped how strangers responded when they asked what you do. It gave you a place in the hierarchy of the world, a legible position that others could immediately understand and locate within their own framework of value. When that position disappears, you do not just lose a job, you lose legibility. The world no longer knows what to do with you, and in their confusion you feel your own. The first phase of retirement is almost never what people expect. The fantasy is that energy returns, that creativity surges, that the hobbies you deferred for decades rush in to fill the hours. But for many people, what actually happens in the first weeks and months is something closer to collapse. Not dramatic collapse, quiet collapse. A heaviness that arrives without explanation. A fog that sits between you and the things you thought you wanted to do. A loss of motivation that feels shameful because you are supposed to be enjoying this. You are supposed to be free. And yet, here you are, sitting in a house you worked your entire life to afford, feeling something that resembles depression and having no idea how to explain it to anyone who has not been through it. This is not weakness. It is withdrawal, not in the clinical sense, in the structural sense. Your brain has spent decades receiving regular doses of purpose, recognition, social contact, problem solving, and identity confirmation through work. Every meeting attended, every deadline met, every problem solved, every small victory achieved delivered a neurochemical signal that said, you matter. You are needed. Your presence here has consequence. When that signal stops, the brain does not simply adjust. It searches. It scans for the source of stimulation that used to be there and cannot find it. And in that scanning, it generates anxiety, restlessness, and a low-grade panic that the conscious mind often cannot identify because it does not look like a crisis. It looks like a Tuesday with nothing on the calendar. It looks like a Wednesday that feels exactly like Tuesday. It looks like a month of Wednesdays, each one quieter than the last, each one asking the same question that no hobby or vacation has yet been able to answer. What am I for now? And the people around you do not help. Not because they are unkind, because they are reading from a script that does not match your experience. You should be happy. You earned this. Just enjoy it. These words arrive with warmth and good intentions, but they land on a nervous system that is grieving, and they feel beneath the kindness, like a door being closed, as though the only acceptable response to retirement is gratitude, as though any other feeling is inappropriate, ungrateful, or evidence that something is wrong with you rather than evidence that something enormous has changed, and your system needs time to catch up with it. One of the least acknowledged losses in retirement is the loss of social architecture. Because for most people, work did not just provide income. It provided a social world, one that arrived automatically every morning without any effort required to maintain it. You had colleagues you spoke with daily. You had routines that created ambient connection. You had a place where people expected you, recognized you, acknowledged your presence, and relied on your contribution. This social fabric was not something you built intentionally. It was a byproduct of showing up. And because it came without effort, its value was almost entirely invisible until it disappeared. After retirement, the social landscape changes immediately and often brutally. The colleagues who felt like friends call less frequently. Then rarely. Then not at all. Not out of cruelty. Out of context. They are still inside the system that generated the connection. You are outside it now. And without the shared structure that held the relationship in place, the bond does not sustain itself the way you assumed it would. This leaves many retired people in a social position they have not occupied since adolescence, needing to build connection from scratch, needing to find community without the scaffolding of a workplace, needing to be the one who initiates, who shows up, who creates the context for belonging. And for someone who has spent decades inside a social system that was provided for them, this task can feel not just difficult, but foreign. as though the skill of making friends outside of work was one they never had to develop. And now, at 60 or 65, they are being asked to learn it for the first time. The loneliness that follows is not always visible. It hides behind busy schedules and planned activities, behind hobbies taken up more out of obligation than passion, behind the phrase keeping busy, which is often less a description of contentment than a strategy for survival. Because the alternative, admitting that you are lonely in a life the world considers enviable, requires a kind of vulnerability that most people in this phase of life have not been trained to practice. And for men in particular, this transition can be devastating, because in many cultures the social architecture of male adult life is almost entirely dependent on work. The friendships, the conversations, the sense of belonging, the daily contact with other human beings, all of it was mediated by the workplace. Remove the workplace and what remains is often startlingly thin. A partner if they are lucky, children who have their own lives, and a silence that spreads across the day in a way that would have been unimaginable during the years when the phone never stopped ringing and the calendar was always full. This is not a failure of character. It is a failure of structure. The structure provided everything, and when it was removed, it revealed how little had been built outside of it. There is a specific moment that many retired people describe but rarely share. The moment they realized that the world continued without them. The company did not collapse. The team adjusted. The projects moved forward. The meetings kept happening. The emails kept arriving, just not to them anymore. And while this should be obvious, while every rational mind knows that no one is irreplaceable, the emotional experience of watching the world function perfectly well in your absence is quietly devastating. Because beneath the rational understanding lives a deeper and more vulnerable truth. The hope that you mattered in a way that could not be replaced, that the gap you left would remain a gap, that someone would notice the specific shape of your absence and find that nothing else could fill it. And when that does not happen, when the machine continues running smoothly without you, the nervous system receives a message that feels disproportionately painful. You were not as essential as you believed. And that message, even when the conscious mind knows it is not the whole truth, lands in the body like a small grief, not for the job, for the version of yourself that the job allowed you to be. This is where the death metaphor becomes most accurate, because what retirement kills is not your body. It is your relevance, or rather the specific form of relevance that your career provided. The daily proof that you were needed, the continuous confirmation that your skills, your judgment, your presence had consequence in the world. That proof was never permanent, but it arrived so reliably for so many years that it began to feel like a feature of reality rather than a feature of circumstance. And when the circumstance changes, the reality it supported collapses. And what remains is a person standing in the rubble of a structure they did not realize they were living inside. And the rubble is disorienting precisely because it is invisible. You cannot point to it. You cannot show someone the wreckage. From the outside, your life looks the same. The house is the same. The bank account is perhaps even healthier than before. The calendar is open, which is supposed to be enviable. But inside, the architecture that held your sense of self has crumbled, and rebuilding it requires something that no amount of financial planning or retirement seminars ever prepared you for. The willingness to grieve. The willingness to admit that what you lost was not just a paycheck, but a psychological home, and the willingness to stand in the open without one, long enough for something new to begin forming. But here is the part that the first months of retirement cannot show you. The death is not the end of the story. It is the clearing. There is another dimension of this transition that catches many people off guard. The change it brings to the relationships inside the home. For decades, work created a natural rhythm of separation and reunion. You left in the morning. You returned in the evening. The distance was built into the structure of the day, and that distance gave both partners room to breathe, to be individuals, to miss each other in the small and healthy way that sustains long-term intimacy. When retirement removes that structure, two people who have spent decades loving each other at a comfortable distance suddenly find themselves sharing the same space for every hour of every day. And the adjustment is not always gentle. Routines collide. Habits that were invisible become irritating. The unspoken agreement about who owns which part of the house and which part of the day dissolves without a replacement. And both partners discover that the relationship they had was partly shaped by the absence that work provided. Without that absence, the relationship has to find a new form, and finding it takes more honesty, more patience, and more willingness to renegotiate than most retirement fantasies account for. What feels like emptiness is actually space, space that was never available while the career was running. Space that could not exist inside a schedule that accounted for every hour. Space that your identity could not access because the role was taking up too much room. And into that space, slowly and without announcement, something begins to grow. Not the old purpose. Something different. Something that does not depend on a title or an office, or the approval of a manager who controlled your calendar. This transition does not happen quickly, and it does not happen automatically. It requires something that the working years rarely demanded: the willingness to sit inside not knowing, to tolerate the discomfort of being undefined, to allow identity to become fluid in a way that feels destabilizing at first, and then gradually begins to feel like freedom. Not the freedom of the brochure, not the freedom of the beach, the freedom of no longer needing an external structure to tell you who you are, the freedom of discovering that the person underneath the role is still there, has always been there, and has been waiting patiently for the room to finally exist. The people who navigate this transition most fully are not the ones who immediately replace work with more activity. They are the ones who allow the emptiness to do its work, who sit with the grief long enough to hear what it is actually saying, who understand that the death of the old identity is not a failure of retirement. It is the prerequisite for what comes next, and what comes next is not a smaller life. It is a life built on a different foundation, one where meaning is not assigned by a system, but discovered by a self that finally has time to look. And this is where something unexpected often emerges, a relationship with time that the working years made impossible. Time that is not measured by productivity. Time that is not justified by output. Time that exists for its own sake and asks nothing of you except that you inhabit it. For someone who has spent decades measuring their worth by what they accomplish between 9 and 5, this kind of time can feel terrifying at first. But for those who learn to stay inside it, it becomes something they did not know they were missing. The ability to follow a thought to its natural end without being interrupted. The ability to notice the world at a pace that reveals detail. The busy years blurred past. The ability to sit with another person and have a conversation that is not squeezed between obligations. This is not idleness. It is the kind of living that the career, for all its rewards, never had room to offer. This is not a story about the end of usefulness. It is a story about the painful and necessary passage between a life defined by what you did and a life defined by who you are when you are no longer doing it. That passage is disorienting. It is lonely. It is longer than anyone tells you it will be. And it is one of the most important psychological transitions a human being can go through. Because on the other side of it is something the working years could never provide. The experience of being enough without producing anything, of mattering without being needed, of waking up on a morning with nothing scheduled and feeling for the first time that the emptiness is not a void. It is an opening. If you are in this passage, or approaching it, or watching someone you love move through it, there is nothing wrong with the weight you feel. The grief is real. The disorientation is real. The loneliness is real. And none of it means the decision was wrong. It means you are between identities. And that space, while it does not feel like it, is where the next version of you is quietly being built. If this put words to something you have been carrying, you are not alone in it. This channel is a space for the psychological experiences that shape us, but rarely get named. If this meant something to you, consider subscribing so these conversations continue to find you. And if any part of this described your experience, leave it in the comments. Because the passage out of a career and into yourself is not one anyone should have to walk without being witnessed. Thank you for watching.